Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you here for the briefing for this evening. I'd like to thank you all for your participation this evening and learning in the briefing of what is to be expected in the race. Tonight we will be addressed by Daniel Gillis from AMSA, and I do want to acknowledge the support we have from these authorities, especially that Daniel has given up his time to join us and brief us on the support we can expect in this race. You'll hear from David Jordan in relation to what the race committee needs to communicate about the weather and the sailing instructions for the race. And as well, you'll hear from David Kellett in relation to the communications, and Dennis Thompson will address us on behalf of CNC. I want to thank you all for engaging in the race, the 22 boats that have entered, and we'll hit the start line. I hope you're all comfortable with the adventure you're about to take. I want to thank all of your crews and everybody for taking the time to participate in this race, and we'll talk about that in a moment in relation to the briefings. Daniel, can I call you to the microphone, please? Daniel Gillis from AMSA.
Okay, just give me a second. All right, we're good to go. Thank you. Thanks for having me up at the Cruising Yacht Club and for your attention over the next 5 minutes or so. I'll try to keep it brief without too much technical detail that you really don't need to know or care about with regards to satellites and beacons. But what I will tell you are some things for you to consider before you depart, and if things don't go well for you on the way, what you can expect from us or other search and rescue authorities, depending on whereabouts you are along your voyage, and how things might go for you. So I'll go through beacons, registration of beacons and why that's important, how to use them. If you haven't had to use one before, that's very good. Some of the SAR assets and some expectation management with regards to how far those assets can get offshore and what they can do for you once they do get there and when they can get there. We'll talk about search and rescue regions so you know who will be responsible for coordination of a search and rescue operation if things do go bad. Talk a little bit about self-help, survival, boat transfers and helicopter operations. Telemedical advice if you need it along the way, and also just at the end I'll give you a reminder to make sure that your beacon registration and voyage information is up to date for the way back as well, because it's often the case that things go bad on the way back. So, there's a whole bunch of rubbish up there about how beacons work. What you need to know is that there are a couple of different types of beacon alerts that we receive in JRCC Australia. We manage the Mission Control Centre for the beacons, so anytime you set off an Australian beacon anywhere in the world, the alert will come to us in Canberra. There's a couple of different types of alerts. The important differences are sometimes you get a position with them, sometimes you don't. When you do get a position, it may be accurate to within 125 metres, to within 5 miles, or over 50 nautical miles, depending on the satellite that picked it up and how good a look it got at the satellite when it went over. So, this is why we harp on about beacon registration. If we get a beacon detection from what's called a geostationary satellite, and it doesn't have a GPS position encoded in the data that's detected by the satellite, we don't know where you are. You could be in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the northern, the southern hemisphere, anywhere within the footprint of that satellite, which is massive. So the first thing we do is look at your beacon registration information and call the people who are listed on there to find out where you are and what you're doing. So if your beacon's not registered and it gets picked up by a satellite and it's not correctly deployed, which is often the case when boats roll over, we won't be able to find you because we won't know who you are or where you are. So make sure your beacons are all registered correctly. Often with races that the CYCA organises and many other race officials and yacht clubs, we get a special event from them as well with a list of PLBs. The reason for that is that the PLBs aren't necessarily associated with the vessels you're in, so once they give us those lists, then we can link them to the yachts that you're on, so we can figure out faster where you might be without having to wake up your emergency contacts at 4 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, our phones all list as private numbers when we dial out from the RCC, so we're very often call screened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's very hard for us to get information when beacons go off in the middle of the night. So please make sure your beacons are correctly registered. If you need to, you can call the beacon registration department at AMSA at business hours tomorrow and they'll check those for you to make sure they are, if you're unsure. If you have to use one, so EPIRBs, you all know the difference between a PLB and an EPIRB. An EPIRB is a big one. It's designed to go for a minimum of 48 hours in cold water. It'll go for a lot longer than that in warm environments. It's designed to float upright and it works best when it's in the water. It uses the surrounding water to help propagate the radio signal. So if you need to use one, put it in the water and attach it to yourself, your life raft or your vessel via a lanyard. You shouldn't need to be told not to attach it to the boat if the boat is sinking. Some of them are manually activated, some of them are activated by water from a float-free cradle. You should know the difference of what you have and what's required. Essentially, if the beacon is beeping or chirping at you and flashing, then it is on. If it's not doing that, turn it on. PLBs are only required to work for a minimum of 24 hours in cold environments. They too will go for a very long time in warm environments. They need the aerial to be vertical. So if you have it on your PFD and you're floating in the water on your back, you may find that we are getting inaccurate position data from it because the antenna is not properly deployed. Some of them have adjustable antennas, so please keep in mind if you do have to set one off and you are lying on your back or you're putting it down on the deck or strapping it onto something on the vessel, adjust the antenna so it's pointing directly upwards. Make sure it's attached to you as well. If you have to use one, you'll hear it beeping or chirping at you. Once you set it off, the distress message will go via satellite to us in Canberra. We'll check your registration details, talk to the police if you're within range of police, talk with race officials, and JRCC Australia will coordinate the search and rescue, provided you're in the Australian search and rescue region. If you're in Noumea's or New Zealand search and rescue region, the information will be forwarded to them automatically, assuming it's registered and we know where it is. Before I get on to that, one important point with regards to activating beacons if you are in distress. EPIRBs and PLBs often inadvertently go off, and our level of concern in the JRCC is heightened when we receive one, but is further heightened if we receive two. So if you have an EPIRB and a PLB, and your vessel is in distress, set two of them off. Set an EPIRB off and a PLB off. It's very, very uncommon for two beacons to accidentally go off at once, and we're likely to start sending assets a lot quicker if we get two beacons rather than one. We'll still respond to one beacon, but we may make a few phone calls first to try and make sure that you're okay and it didn't just get wet. Don't set off all of the EPIRBs or PLBs. If you have one per crew member, don't set off half a dozen PLBs, because that will interfere with the satellite's ability to give us a good position, and it will also interfere with aircraft's ability to accurately home the beacon and find you. So, if you're all in a group, our advice is to activate one EPIRB and one PLB. If you are becoming separated from a group, obviously activate your PLB and leave it on. Don't activate all of them if you're in a group, because it will make it harder for the satellites to decipher who's where. So, aircraft. You can see up the top left there is the old Dornier 328 that we no longer use for search and rescue. It's been replaced with the Challenger, which is a jet aircraft down the bottom right. We have one of those based in Cairns. And on your voyage, if you activate a distress beacon, it is probably going to be the first thing that is tasked. During the daytime, they're on what we call the Ready 30, which means that we give them a priority tasking. They will be wheels up within 30 minutes. Their transit time is generally, or their transit speed I should say, is generally about 400 knots, so they will get to you relatively quickly. It is drop capable. It can drop life rafts, medical supplies, a range of other equipment. At night time, that drop would be from lower safe altitude, which is 1,500 feet, which we would consider to be not an accurate drop or a non-precision drop, and we're unlikely to get the stores to you, and even if we do, you're unlikely to see them. So it won't drop equipment to you at night unless there's no other option, and even then it will be very difficult for you to retrieve it if you can see the trailing line that it drops out. Helicopters, there's a number and a variety of types of helicopters up the north coast of New South Wales and southeast coast of Queensland. The A139 you see down the bottom left-hand side has a relatively long range and has quite a lot of space in it. I think that's a BK, the top right, which doesn't. Both of those are in service on the coast of New South Wales. For planning's sake, what we generally work on with regards to helicopter operation is around about 100 nautical miles offshore. Once you get outside of that, an aircraft may get to you and find you, but it probably won't have time to do anything effective on scene in terms of winching you to safety. So what you need to understand with regards to helicopter operations is that once you get outside of 100 nautical miles off the coast, you are unlikely to be retrieved by helicopter if you are in distress. You are more likely to be boat transferred. There are exceptions to that with regards to military aircraft, but in general you can plan for 100 miles.
Can we have quiet, please? Hey, Rainbow! Can you turn it down a bit? Quiet! No briefing here.
It's not often people can't hear me. That's impressive. So aircraft, the other assets we will send to you will be surface assets, obviously. And these are the types that you may encounter. Merchant vessels are very likely to be transiting through the route that you are on and are very likely to be diverted if we receive a distress beacon or other indications of your vessel or people being in distress. I don't need to say to you the issues with that other freeboard of those vessels, and I'll show you a video of that shortly. The vessel on the top right there is the police-launched Nemesis, which is based here in Sydney. It has an operating range of probably about 600 nautical miles offshore. It's an extremely capable vessel. It has a tender that launches out of the transom at the back. I used to work on it. It's a good boat. The furthest we've sent it is about 270 nautical miles offshore to conduct a rescue for us. Your trouble with regards to it will be that you'll be getting to the northeast pretty quickly and outside of their area of responsibility where we can reasonably ask them to go. Volunteer marine rescue, obviously, when you're close inshore, if you need assistance from them. You probably all had exposure to them at some point in your sailing careers. So search and rescue regions. I've printed out 26 copies of this particular slide for you in case you want to keep it in a handy billy or just write down that, that latitude and longitude. You'll see the Australian search and rescue region generally for your voyage at the very least. Longitude 163 degrees east is where the Australian boundary is. Once you cross that, you will either be in New Zealand's area or Noumea's area, depending on the route you take. You can see up in the northeast of the Australian area a dotted line. That is the shared search and rescue region that both Australia and Noumea are responsible. You can consider that Australia will respond and coordinate a search and rescue activity if you're in that area. If you don't have their contact details, come and grab a printout rather than trying to write them all down now. They're all 24-hour search and rescue centres. They're all very reliable with manning the phones. They're not like some of our other neighbouring search and rescue regions that don't always answer the phone. The only issue you'll have with MRCC Noumea is that a lot of them have a fairly strong accent, but they do speak English. They always answer the phone and we talk to them and communicate with them often and very well. So another quick look at your intended route and the search and rescue regions. Those are helicopters up the coast. That little black line, which is on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, indicates the 100 nautical mile mark where you're likely to be outside of helicopter operation range. That will be fairly early on your voyage. I imagine some of you will probably head out further east more quickly than that and not take that direct route, so you may well be outside of helicopter range very, very quickly. This is the AIS picture of merchant traffic in the area, just to highlight the fact that if you do need assistance, it's most likely going to come to you in the form of merchant shipping. So that being said, what you need to focus on if you are in distress is getting yourself in a position that you can survive for 2 to 3 days unassisted. We can put merchant vessels next to you to provide a lee, and we often do that if you have trouble with rigging or you have other issues that require your vessel to be made a little bit more stable than it otherwise would be. If you do have a catastrophic issue though and you need to abandon for whatever reason, you need to be aware of your drills in terms of taking as much water as you can, as much warm clothing as you can, as much equipment on your life raft as you can, so that you can survive for as long as possible until we can get someone to you. Aircraft operations, even with our Challenger and Cairns, are bound by weather as well. So the weather that causes you to come to grief generally causes them not to be able to fly. So your priority needs to be having a think about what you are going to do if things turn bad now, so that if it does happen, in the unlikely event that it happens, you know what you need to do then. So if you activate your beacon, whether it be inadvertently or not, please tell us. It is very expensive putting up jets to come and find you all the way out in the Coral Sea, and it means that they're not available for other search and rescue operations that we might need them for. So please give us a call as soon as possible if you accidentally activate your beacon. There's no penalty, except maybe a beer or two. Stay on board your yacht or life raft until otherwise directed. That goes without saying. If your vessel is taking on water, for example, please stay on it for as long as possible. I'll show you some video of a life raft shortly as well, which may make you want to stay on it for as long as possible. Assign someone to take responsibility for the EPIRB. You do need to make sure that it remains tethered to your raft or to a person and that it's working properly, and someone needs to be responsible for that. The last thing you want to do is drift off in a different direction to your beacon. Keep it on until told to turn it off, even if you see a merchant ship, a helicopter overhead, whatever it may be, until you have somebody with you who physically tells you to turn the beacon off, leave it on. Use visual signals to attract attention. If you hear a jet fly over you, even if you're not in distress, please come up on deck. If we don't see you waving or attracting attention or signalling us in any way, we'll just assume the worst and keep sending things to you. And use multiple beacons. As I said before, if you do have a distress, activate your EPIRB and one PLB. If you are in a group and you are getting separated, then activate PLBs for everybody. It's just a quick video. There's a quick video here of a merchant vessel that's providing some assistance to a yacht. I won't play the whole thing. You'll get the idea fairly shortly. This is why merchant vessels are not ideally placed for rescuing or provide assistance to small vessels, just to give you a concept of scale. That's about a 34-foot yacht. You can see there's a pilot boarding door where the person has got off onto the merchant ship, which was still a ladder climb up. It's not ideal. So helicopter transfers, if you are within range of a helicopter. I note there is a military operation off Shoalwater Bay in Queensland at the moment involving the LHD and a number of rotary assets. That doesn't mean we can get one to you, but there is a possibility that maybe, if you're very lucky, we could get a helicopter out of further than 100 nautical miles, or that there'll be a frigate with a helicopter embarked somewhere in the Coral Sea that can help you. So if that's the case, make sure you have VHF channel 16 turned on, because all of the helicopters will communicate with you on VHF channel 16. Follow their directions. They're very keen on making sure that they have their helicopter positioned in a certain way so that the pilot can be pointed into the wind and seeing your vessel at the same time. Stow all of your loose equipment and remove or frap and secure all sails. You'll probably find with helicopter operations that they won't winch anyone to you on board your yacht unless your rigging is all gone. And even then they may be unwilling. The most of them will require you to stream a life raft from your vessel and be winched out of a life raft if you do need to be evacuated by helicopter. Start the engine and steer into the weather. You will get instructions from the helicopter via VHF channel 16, assuming it's working, on what you should do and which way you should point your vessel if you're able to. Turn your radar to standby, they don't like those, and be ready to launch a life raft. There's a quick video here, I'll only play the first sort of 30 seconds of it. Most of you are you on racing yachts, mostly? Yep. So you've probably got the smallest, lightest life rafts that you can get on there. That's okay. It is what it is. But here's a quick video of a rescue operation that we did earlier this year from a yacht with a life raft. So the yacht's not in the picture, but the crew of the yacht have abandoned to this life raft and are going to be winched. And if you just want to pay close attention to what the rotor wash from the helicopter does to the raft as it gets near, you'll see that it's not a very fun operation. So with that in mind, the more weight that you have in the life raft, the more stable it will be. Please don't get into the water until a helicopter crew person has told you to get into the water. I know you might be keen to go for a swim. They do move around quite a bit. They're fairly uncomfortable. One of the tethers from one of the life rafts involved in this operation actually snapped as well. So just be mindful and don't get in the life raft until you've been told to by the helicopter crew. And stay in the life raft until somebody is in the water next to the raft and telling you to get out. So medical assistance, if you need medical assistance, you can go through your race committee. If you can't get them or you need direct advice from a doctor, you can contact us. We do have a telemedical advice service. I'll give you the details of that shortly. If you require evacuation from a crewman for whatever reason, we'll do our best to do that, or we can drop some medical equipment to you from the jet that you saw pictures of earlier. Once again, bear in mind that if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we're not going to drop you medical stores. They'll come to you at first light. So the telemedical advice service that we provide is contracted through CareFlight. They have a doctor on standby 24 hours. If you need telemedical advice, you can come directly to us through the contact phone numbers that was on the slide earlier, which you can get a copy of up here if you need. Or you can get it via HF on 6, 8, 10 or 12 meg by contacting RCC Australia, Victor India Charlie. They'll do a phone patch with the doctor and get that advice to you. It's easier to do via satellite phone. If you have a satellite phone on board, it's easier for you to call us and tell us that you need medical advice. We'll call CareFlight and they will have a doctor call you. Whilst the doctor is talking to you, we'll be making whatever plans we can make to get something to you that can get your crew member off and to a medical facility as soon as possible. But given that some of the places you're going to be in are quite remote, that may still be you making best possible speed to Noumea or the closest port. So lastly, for your return voyage, if you change crews to bring the yacht back, change the number of people on board, change the destination or any other intentions on your vessel or the PLBs on board, whatever it might be, please let our beacon registration department know. You can get onto the beacon registration information for your beacon and put a little comment in there saying that you're coming back to Sydney or wherever you're coming back to from Noumea with this many crew on board, whether it's the same crew or delivery crew, whatever it might be. We do find that we get probably just as many distress situations from vessels on their way back from races as during the race. And whilst there's a lot of governance over what happens with regards to beacons and safety equipment and protocols during the race, that doesn't always exist on the way back. So if you could please just be conscious of your delivery voyage on the way back, what information you've given to your emergency contacts so that they can tell us if you have an emergency what's going on board. So that's all I have for you tonight. I would like to wish you all the best of luck with your voyages. I will stay back here for another hour or so and maybe have a cheeky beer or two, and we'll be around to answer any questions that you have with regards to beacons, search and rescue operations in general, or MH370, which I'm constantly asked about. So please feel free to come and see me. I also have copies of that slide with contact details for MRCC, Noumea, RCC or New Zealand and JRCC Australia. If you'd like, feel free to come and grab one of those for me just to stick on your boat in case you need to call someone. Okay, thanks for your attention and all the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you all appreciate the work done by AMSA and the team that AMSA stays online for 24 hours or more, but Daniel's put a lot of effort into tonight's presentation. Please join me again in thanking Daniel and AMSA. And again, the club is able to put on an event like this with the support of volunteers, and indeed the race committee includes a number of volunteers. I'll be calling David up in a moment, but to acknowledge the effort and the work done by this committee is important, having regard also that there'll be more work than's required on a watch basis while the race is on, because this is the longest race the club will be conducting for the first time again in 25 years. David, would you please come up and address us on behalf of the race committee?
Thanks, Commodore. I'll get you to do it, Stephen. Well, we'll just get ourselves organised. Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. All right. So the weather, firstly. These are the slides as provided by the Bureau, so I'll step through them piece by piece. If there is a meteorologist or a village witch doctor who knows a little bit more about weather matters, please don't be afraid to put your hand up and correct anything where I might be in error. You've seen this slide before. Perhaps I'll leave you to just absorb it for a moment. I would note one piece of information, and it's in deference to the excellent services that the BOM provides. I do have trouble with the term shifting. It doesn't give you an indication of whether the wind's moving left or right. We normally use a left shift or a right shift out on the course. Similarly, you might hear the terms backing or veering. So I'd encourage you to apply that as you go through. Thanks, Steve. Again, an absorption moment for you to just review. We know this. I tend to remember the waves associated with the wind because of the W's, and the swell associated with distance systems, the two S's together. And again, just some nomenclature thing to highlight here, that the term force often gets misused or misunderstood, particularly in relation to storms and thunderstorms as such. In your own time in the public information with the BOM, in respect of the timings, that one there's got the daylight time, I think, so just make sure we've got the right time so you can receive the appropriate skeds or the appropriate broadcasts. And indeed on the internet, for the next slide, Stevie, in relation to the less difficult one to download, I'd encourage your use of the light version of what the Bureau has to offer. Quite a useful facility. I'm sure you've all seen it before. And again, one we tend to use quite a lot, the coastal waters forecasts. The areas for us will be up the New South Wales coast. Next. Again, I'm making an assumption you're very familiar with these. Where you can get a little lost is on the borders of those, or when we're trying to infer where we might be in future and which particular forecast or warning might apply to us in which region. So again, just an understanding of those is very useful. An example of the coastal waters forecasts, again, hopefully when you see one with a warning in the top left, the yellow or a highlighted colour to grab your attention with the eye. And as you go through them, I find it useful to not just look at the one line for the day you're at, perhaps look at the other so that you get a little bit of a trend and a feel for what's around the actual timing that you're looking at. Thanks, Steve. An example of the warnings that are promulgated. And onto the high seas forecast for us, the northeastern and the southeastern, an understanding of when you cross and the applicability of those would be useful. And an example of the high seas forecast, and we've all had our days sitting in the bottom of the boat listening to HF and trying to picture as someone's describing a whole bunch of these weird and wonderful weather systems to us. I find a nice chartlet of the area you're racing in to be useful, and maybe you're drawing a pictorial as it's being said to you and noting particular things, such as a low pressure system in the mid-Tasman Sea, and you can start to plot it and get a better way to gain the picture and the information that's been provided to you, often over a very sort of delicate medium of communication. And lastly, the Met-Eye, again, quite familiar to us all. Please make sure we've got an understanding of the colours and the gradients as they apply to the various wind scales. Right, and on to the weather proper. So that was for this morning, the general situation. The low pressure in the Tasman is starting to dominate. The high has been a feature for us for quite a while now. That transition probably occurred today with the cooler winds starting to become a little bit more prevalent. The cold front at Western Australia, while not a direct influence on us, is actually going to force the argument between the high and the low, and that will accelerate the dissipation of the high and allow the low to move forward, hopefully. A satellite imagery of that previous chart, noting the more disturbed air and cloud masses over to the Western Australia and through the Tasman. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so the mean sea level prognosis forecast for the next 4 days, firstly today and tomorrow. What I'd like to highlight from my understanding of the weather is looking at the gradient between the high over the continental Australia and the low feature in the Tasman Sea. And look at that gradient, the isobars are fairly tight as we go through. And the next day, Stevie. And on to the next day, again, it's not really until later on in the weekend, late in the weekend, that we start to see those isobars separating a little bit more, and therefore, with it, conditions easing somewhat. For Sydney, at the start, very much a southerly, the southwesterly flow, again at 20 to 30 knots. Thanks, Steve. For race start in the harbour, as you can see, just a reminder here that Noumea, from recollection, 1 hour ahead of us. So as you're converting your times and map as you get closer to Noumea, please do allow for that. Thanks, Stevie. And offshore for race start, you'll see a fair bit of not so pleasant colour there at the moment. We'll keep skipping through, please. You don't want to watch it? No. Saturday evening and then again into Sunday morning, you'll get an appreciation for how that low is starting to move a little bit, and the effects of the high pushing up against it are lessening a lot. So the gradient between the two along the northern New South Wales coast and into the Tasman Sea is lessening somewhat. Keep going through, mate. And into Sunday evening, and we'll scroll through. Thanks, Steve. Monday, the picture eases as most of the competitors will get mid to the upper part of the race course and into a more forgiving, lighter breeze from the south. The good news is, all the way through to Tuesday, the forecast is very much southerly, and in effect, it's all driven by the one system, so we're not getting a confused picture. So in that sense, a little bit of relief. Onto the Noumea forecast. That's just for a few days around the weekend, just to give us a feel for the sort of conditions that are there at the moment. I would highlight that there are, at this time of year, opportunity for thunderstorms around Noumea and the wider New Caledonia island group. And in summary, the Bureau advises us, as you can see there, that low is quite prevalent, and their words, persistent, vigorous southwesterly to southeasterly winds for the next few days is probably relevant to us. Thank you. That's the weather. Are there any questions in particular or something I can take on notice in respect of the weather? I'm more than happy to do so. Otherwise, I'll crack on with some more direct race committee things. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. Can I address that at the end of the next session? Good segue though, sir. Thank you. Great. Any others? Great. Sorry? All good? On behalf of the race committee chairman, Tim Cox, who's overseas on business, but he's scheduled to be here for race start, thanks for your attendance, and more importantly, thanks for your participation. Thanks also to the owners, skippers, crews and the various delegates who've done so well in working proactively with the sailing office to get us all nearly up to speed. Your efforts are much appreciated. I'd like to start with safety, our primary concern. As the Commodore outlined, the first time we've run the race for 25 years. The finish is in another country. The course passes through two and adjacent a third search and rescue region. As Dan has highlighted, you may be days away from direct assistance. It's a long and complex race by any measure, over 1,000 miles with different currents and the potential for prolonged exposure to large open swells, to name a few characteristics we don't regularly sail in. You need to be self-sufficient and efficient. The Water Police view racing vessels as self-sufficient, and long-range assistance for other than Mayday is unlikely, especially in an immediate context. Dan's talked about the lack of range of helicopters. The area is also something a little bit different to what we've normally cruise or race in. I've had the pleasure of having been to Norfolk Island, Lord Howe Island, and most of the Coral Sea Island territories, including Middleton and Elizabeth Reefs. I've done that numerous times by ship and by yacht. No doubt they're beautiful places, but they're very difficult to access, and certainly 24/7 access is not guaranteed. And there's not a lot of assistance when you get there. Particularly with Lord Howe, I'd ask you to note and understand the restrictions in the lagoon, both in terms of depth and access. Fuel. The requirement is for enough fuel to allow for a 450-mile transit. That's based on a notional point Noumea, just over 600 miles along the racecourse, allowing for a 5% cross-track distance. A boat could conservatively be 450 miles from the nearest port of refuge where you can get 24/7 access. And I think 5% cross-track distance, looking at some of the routing for potentially the leading boats, is conservative. Also, please carry enough water. In extension of Dan's offering, the French forces in New Caledonia do have some assets, a couple of Falcon business jets that are converted for search and rescue. They could, similarly to the AMSA assets, drop survival gear and the like to you. There are some short-range helicopters, a couple of ageing patrol boats, and a somewhat newer ocean patrol vessel. As Dan highlighted, SAR is likely going to be through Australia. I'd ask you to consider that any crew members with known medical conditions perhaps review the necessity for them to participate in the race. Again, you're going to be days away from medical assistance, and knowing that, I think, could well be a little bit of an own goal. Please ensure you've reviewed your man overboard procedures, the crew are familiar with the requirements, and that you're well practiced. Recent man overboard incidents highlight the need for understanding your equipment and of the speed, time and distance associated with the man overboard. You're reminded of the changes to special regulations in respect of wearing life jackets. As an extension of that, I encourage your proactive use of safety lines or tethers. Again, the tragic incident with John Fisher only highlights that. Please also ensure that you've thoroughly reviewed arrangements and procedures in respect of life rafts. And also please check your emergency steering arrangements, conscious that there might be a fairly prolonged period of emergency steering, not just 3 hours to the nearest port on the coast. Trackers, they seem to work very well when you don't touch them. The start, please note the use of the limiting mark at the start line. I'd urge your consideration of the length of the race versus the eagerness to gain 1 second at race start, so please adopt a relevant strategy. There are no additional people that were facilitated for in the race instructions, so there will be no jumpers from any of the boats on departure. Please note the requirements around protest. Just for clarification, the words used are outside Sydney Harbour, just to clarify the application of rules. It's defined as a line extending from the light on North Head to Hornby Light on South Head. That's for this race. I encourage you to read the pilot, especially in respect of the approaches to and the entrances at Noumea. It needs a navigational plan more than just scaling down on the chart plotter as someone gets up in the morning. Please note requirements around declarations and for the submission of such. Again, following from Dan's point about the return passage, I encourage you to have considered a plan that has some robustness. A little bit of time, some next of kin detail, communication is very useful. And I'd encourage you to lodge that with AMSA so that if there is something raised, they have an extra bit of information immediately hand to support you. And just a reminder that the responsibility for the return passage by whatever means and however that's undertaken is by the person in charge. The organising authority and the race committee don't have a responsibility or association with your return passage. I'll leave communications to David Kellett. However, I do wish to raise 4 points. Firstly, please keep the race committee and sailing manager informed as we go. We have a wider view of the race. Secondly, I'd ask you to please have a robust internal sat phone regime. It's no use us getting to Noumea and having a few sherbets and then saying, oh, what's the red flashing light on the phone mean? Yeah, we've probably been trying to contact you. Third, the pass mark for skids is 100%. I would ask your proactive persistence and proactive participation in working HF for a relatively complex complan. Finally, on the communication aspects, the key stakeholder numbers, mobile numbers, in particular Justine's and Tim's, the race committee chairman, their numbers are there on the contact list, or will be, for you. After Tuesday, when a lot of the race control relocates to Noumea, I just ask you to, if it is of a routine or relatively routine nature, to please contact us on the listed SIM cards for Noumea. The data usage and rate for us at the other end is quite expensive if we don't use those SIM cards. Just a courtesy, and thank you. Some parish notices before I sign off. If you haven't got through the HF radio check as yet, please a reminder to do so by 5 p.m. tomorrow. A detail of admin for tonight, please, Patrice, if we could get one more of your crew to sign in, that would be appreciated. And could the following yachts please see the sailing office? 41 Sud, Yeah Baby, More Witchcraft, Santana, Smuggler, K Mai. We just need to get through a final bit of admin with you. Thanks for that. In answer to your question, sir, that someone had there, yes, the race committee chairman is in Spain at the moment, and we've had opportunity to communicate with him this afternoon. He's acutely aware of the weather conditions that are forecast for Saturday at race start. To borrow that line, safety is our number one priority, and Tim is certainly taking a very, very close look at the circumstance. A forecast, however, is a forecast. It can change, it might change, it probably will change. In a physical sense, if we're all to believe forecasts, we'd be extremely rich. From a weather perspective, I acknowledge it has been somewhat easing during the week in some aspects. Then again, the effects of the low don't fully take place yet for about another 24 hours or so. So with that in mind, the race committee chairman has asked us to continue our preparations for a race start on Saturday. noting that the forecast is a forecast and it can change. To make any other call now would be to perhaps miss an opportunity. So we're proceeding on the basis of a race start on Saturday. We'll be reviewing as we go. The most likely opportunity to advise of any postponement to the start would be at the Saturday race briefing. I've known and worked with Tim for 3 decades in various capacities. I just offer a private thought outside of his direct advice, and that is he's a somewhat conservative man, and he always reminds me that in the race committee game, you're the one sitting in front of the coroner. I'll just leave you with that context. Sorry, Howard, thank you.
In the event that the Bureau put up a car warning on Saturday, are you expecting to start the race in light of that car warning? In other words, you're putting it right back on us with our insurers and the potential risks in that car warning market. You're talking about 33 to 45 and a seaway which will be challenging to dangerous. So they're telling right. Is there a policy that if the car warning up on Saturday will be going to postpone to Sunday, or do we have to be prepared, or we wait round on Saturday morning, having cleared departure? Is there a facility for the departure to be changed with border control, etc.? We have a time frame to do that.
I'll just outline the 2 essences of the question, which are a subset of the previous one you asked there, sir. And the first one is, more directly, if there is a GAR warning, will you postpone the race start? I'll answer that in a moment. Secondly, and as an extension of that question, some admin type arrangements and support stuff, customs, and that sort of bailiwick, and how does that get affected? And I'll hand over to Justine to address that one first, and then I'll close out on the first.
So yes, the weather, we have put a contingency plan in place, even though no decision will be made before 8:30, and we have notified Border Force, so they're aware there may be some crew changes if we had to delay until a Sunday morning start.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Commodore. Well relayed.
Do we have a time as to when, like each hour, as to when the decision will be made?
So that sort of length of string type proposition we could chase, and the variance in forecast might not realise itself as we plan out. So to allow definitive planning, a decision on postponement, if there is to be one, will not be made until the weather briefing at 8:30 on Saturday morning.
I agree. And then, how many hours after for the next decision?
I know, I would anticipate that the amount of information, and noting this weather system and its degradation after a high point of Saturday, would allow a definitive final decision to be made on Saturday morning. There wouldn't be, I don't anticipate a succession of decision making and time manoeuvring. I would anticipate that if there is consideration of that, it would be made at 8:30 on Saturday morning, and I think it would be definitive. My personal view is that would possibly be delayed a number of hours into a day. That sort of figuring. Does that answer your question?
Then it gets complicated because Sunday is very busy again.
The weather forecast that we see provides us, at the moment, provides us with an opportunity to make a decision on Saturday, which would likely have a race start many hours later, or possibly out to about a day later. That's what we see. Back to your question, sorry, Howard, in relation to your proposition that 35 to 45 knots, it is a GAR warning. Is there a policy around GAR warning equals cancellation of race? Not from, or postponement of start or postponement of race fully, yes. There is not a policy as such, or the race committee has not applied any policy in that regard. It's totally around a risk profile, and I would use one case in point here at the moment, and you raised it yourself. Hold the gale warning as a threshold for the moment, and look at a storm warning at the lesser of that. But the combination of the storm warning and the wind, which is currently southerly, which is enough disparity with what is a very large, long gestation, swell and sea combination from a different direction, and in relation to the race course, that may or may not, in another race or this race, present as reaching the threshold. I would argue at the moment, as I see it, that, and history would probably tell you from this organising authority, from the CIC, that putting people out in gale warnings is probably not smart, and a combination of the sea swell conditions and a storm warning would probably also not be smart. But we need to allow the forecast to take its effect and see a little bit closer. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions in relation to what I've said, or in relation in particular to any of the weather and the consideration for postponement of start? Leave you to Dave Kellett perhaps next. Again, a very good segue. I'll pay you guys later for that. Thanks very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, David, thank you very much for such a thorough briefing, both on the weather and the race committee's role. Please pass our thanks on to the other members of the race committee. I'll now invite David Kellett to address us on the communications.
Thank you, Commodore. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll try and be brief. The race frequency for the start is 6516, and we hope to be able to use that all the way. Now, we're going to utilise various stations throughout the race. All will be noted as CYCA race control. We'll have JBW out on the harbour at the start from 11:30 for the pre-race radio checks. If anyone is interested, we urge you to do that. From the start until 2000 hours on Tuesday, we'll be operating from Marine Rescue at Lake Macquarie, where myself and John Woodford will be the operators. John Woodford is the guy that backs me up on JBW and the Rolex Sydney Hobart race each year. He will remain at Lake Macquarie when I transfer to Noumea. Lake Macquarie will be handling a 24/7 watch on the race frequency. So if you're in any difficulty, that's your immediate contact. Any problem getting through to Lake Macquarie, of course, you just use your normal safety frequencies. There'll be 2 skids per day at 08:30 and 20:30, all on Australian Eastern Standard Time for the duration of the race. We know that Noumea is an hour ahead, but we will be sticking to Sydney time for that. The silence period will be observed, and we'll come up with a tuning call 3 minutes past the hour, or the half hour as it is. On Tuesday at 2000 hours, we hope to be operating from Noumea. Otherwise, we'll be maintaining the coverage from Marine Rescue at Lake Macquarie. Now, the sailing instructions call for a race frequency change to 12,359 on Tuesday at 2000 hours. The reason that we've done that is that Lake Macquarie was able to reach Noumea in our testing on the 12 megs. However, as you know, in the middle of the fleet, in the middle of the paddock, we're going to bounce over you. So subject to the comms progress, you'll be instructed at the 0830 sked on Tuesday as to which frequency to use for the evening sked. Hopefully it'll remain on 6516, but there's a possibility it may change to 8294. The plan is for CYC Race Control Noumea to contact 3 vessels, which we've approached, prior to that 2030 sked, just to confirm that we have coverage on 6516 or 8294, or indeed 12359 if we need to. If there is a change, one of those vessels will be requested to come in at the commencement of the sked on 6516 and alert the fleet as to which we will be changing to. We think that is the simplest way to handle it. So stay on 6516 until you're told to change. Once at the entrance to the Bulari Passage at Noumea, you'll see in the instructions that you are to operate on VHF 77 and to contact Sail Noumea Race Control. There are several races finishing in Noumea at about the same time. All will be utilising the Sail Noumea Race Control on VHF 77, and others will be utilising the HF. So we've decided that we will stick to the 77. I'm happy to answer any questions, but just a reminder that we've got 12 hours between skeds. There's lots of electronics on the boat and the batteries will be down. So please remember to charge your batteries before the skeds. So happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
If for whatever reason, despite having done a successful radio check, we can't hear on any of the frequencies, what should we do? Contact you on Saturday?
Yes, sir.
And that will be a satisfactory sked report for that purpose.
You heard what the boss said. 100% on the HF. So you try. You've all been doing really well on your radio checks. They've all been working fine. So hopefully it'll all keep working. Yeah, I don't think we're going to use 12 meg, but we'll see. It's there as a backup. Okay. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, David. And thanks again to the comms team. We have Dennis. I can't see Dennis. There he is. Dennis is going to address us, and it's really good to see Dennis back on the track. And I think he's he's probably more happier than anyone else to be here. Dennis Thompson's representing CNC for us.
Thanks, John. Up in Noumea, I'll have CNC hat on, so I'm representing the club up there, helping with the finish and your arrival and all the bits and pieces that go with it. I was speaking to the Commodore of the CNC yesterday, and he would like me just to welcome you up to Noumea. They're really looking forward to having everybody there and all the boats. It's going to be quite exciting. And he just wanted me to remind you of the race within a race that's happening in New Caledonia. And once you go through Bulari Passage and you get a beam of Armady Light and Tabu Light, an imaginary line between that and the finish line, the boat, that's the racetrack for the race within a race. The times will be taken off the trackers. We can get a pretty accurate fix of when you go through the start line, the virtual start line from Armady Light to Tabu Light. And there is a handicap prize as well as line honours, virtual line honours, the fastest time for that little race. So some pretty good races. So it's about 12 miles up to the finish line. Just be careful once you're inside the reef. there are bombies that are there, so they're pretty well charted, I've found. So have fun up there, and I look forward to seeing you midweek, I think, hopefully.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, this race is actually the culmination of a hell of a lot of work, and I think you'll probably appreciate that from hearing from the people involved. It's come to you from work done at the board level by the administration office and the really hard work of the sailing office team, Justine and her team, a whole team of volunteers. Please just join me in thanking them for their efforts so far. As I said before, it's been 25 years since this race has been run. There's a big learning curve in starting the race up again, so any contributions you have with observations that can make sense to the office and the administration of the race, please pass them on. I'll remind you that last year in the Rolex Sydney to Hobart yacht race, we had the humorous story of a young German man being convinced that he needed his passport to go to Tasmania. The interesting part about this for this race, because we are going to another country, please do not forget your passports. And I really do mean that some people are likely to forget that. A race like this cannot go on without a lot of expense to support a whole lot of things in behind that usually are invisible to the participants. But I do want to thank PONANT for coming up with a lot of money to support us in this race. Thank you very much, and all the best. We'll see you on Saturday morning.